In this video, I'm going to explain to you how Trump and MAGA plan to steal the 2024 election. Stay with me. Hello and welcome everybody. I am attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers, and each and every week we bring you at least one legal analysis of some trending story regarding politics, policies, personalities, or pop culture to empower you with the information you need to defy this unjust legal system. If that interests you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, click the bell so that you will get notified every time we upload one of these powerful and informative videos. Before we get into today's message, please go to Amazon, grab a copy of my book, Education and Justice, where I talk about how public schools fail African-American boys, but what you can do about it. We know school just started, or it will start for some of you, and if you have an African-American male child in public school, you need this book. You will thank me later. All right, so with that said, yes, I want to share with you how MAGA and Trump intend to steal the 2024 election. All right. And so what we're going to look at are the new voting laws that have been passed, some of them from 2013 and others more recently. It's very important that you understand these laws, because if you don't understand and know these laws, these folks will be able to do all sorts of things to suppress your and many other Black people's votes. All right. So I'm going to walk you through this. All right. So obviously the video is going to be a little longer than normal, but you need to hear every bit of this from start to finish. All right. Now, I'm not going to be able to go in a whole lot of detail on each thing that I'm going to share with you. So what you need to do is go to your state's Secretary of State's website with the information that I give you. Just go to your state's Secretary of State's website, do a Google search on voting or on one of these particular laws that I'm going to share with you, and it should come right up. And then you can do some detailed research on what I'm going to share with you. Obviously, it would take all day if I tried to get into the details of all that is going on. So I'm going to give you enough to help you understand what they're trying to do, but then you got to follow up with the research. All right. Okay, so let's get into this. The first thing that we need to do is we need to look at a video of a conservative former federal judge. I've introduced Judge Luttig to you before. His name is J. Michael Luttig, and he was given a talk, and I think it was really good, and he talked about a host of things. In fact, you should watch that talk. Judge Luttig was once up for the Supreme Court as a conservative justice. So this is not a liberal. He's not a Democrat. He is very, very conservative, but he's one of those rare breeds who puts country first, country before party. So I greatly admire and respect Judge Luttig for the principled approach to this whole matter. So let's watch a video of Judge Luttig where he talks about his feelings regarding whether Trump is going to try to steal this election.
First, I say this mainly to servicemen that I see in the airport, but thank you for your service. You're an amazing human being. And I wanted to ask you a question that is not in your area of expertise per se, but is about your experience. Because most of us know that there is an election coming up. And most of us are concerned that if the election goes the way that a lot of people here hope it will go, that all hell is going to break loose in our country. And I wanted to know, not based on your judicial expertise, but based on your common sense and decency, what you think might or will happen if Kamala Harris wins the election.
Well, I have spoken a lot, even recently, on that very question, sir. But first, I told the Congress of the United States 2 years ago that Donald Trump and his allies and supporters are preparing, in plain view of the American people today, to overturn the 2024 election in the same way that they attempted to overturn the 2020 presidential election but failed. I said that 2 years ago to the American people. I've recently said, in response to the many articles that are being written today, that in fact, the former president, the Republican Party, and their allies have already prepared themselves to overturn the 2024 election if, in their view, it's necessary. And of course, we know what that means. That means if he loses. And this is no secret. Those are the words of the former President of the United States of America and the nominee for the presidency of the Republican Party in 2024. It is, again, breathtaking that these are the words and the actions of a President of the United States of America and one of the two political parties in America. The two political parties are the political guardians of our democracy. In his utterly inexplicable obsession with denying January 6th and glorifying January 6th for the past 3.5 years, the former president has corrupted American democracy, such that, in my view, there is only one candidate for the presidency and one political party in America that today can claim the mantle of protector and defender of America's democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law.
All right, so Judge Luttig said quite a bit in that short space of time. And there are, I see, 3 different things that Trump and MAGA could try to do regarding the 2024 election. 1, suppress the votes. And that effort has been underway since about 2013. And I'll explain what I'm saying in a moment. Steal the election. So we saw Trump with the 2020 election calling state representatives and officials and asking them to find him votes. They had developed a slate of fake electors, filing frivolous lawsuits. Obviously, they wanted the former vice president, Mike Pence, to not certify the election. All of those were efforts to steal the election. And third of all, to just deny that he lost. If Vice President Kamala Harris wins, just deny it. So I see a very, very bumpy road ahead regarding this election. November 5th, I just see pandemonium and chaos, to be quite frankly with you. It could get really, really, really ugly. I expect that it will, because I don't believe Trump and MAGA are going to accept defeat, even if Kamala wins overwhelmingly. I think that they will deny it, and I pray that they don't become violent. I've said that before. That's my prayer. So what I want to talk to you about now, and by the way, you heard Judge Luttig say the only party that can claim to be the custodian of our democracy right now. He didn't say this, but obviously we knew he was talking about the Democratic Party. All right? So let's talk about some of the voter suppression laws that MAGA has already put in place, and they're hoping that those laws will prevent a lot of African American people in particular from voting. Okay? All right, so let's go to another screen. And let's start with what voter suppression is. Voter suppression is any deliberate method, tactic, law, policy, regulation, practice, rhetoric, or by any other means, irrespective of its origin, aimed or results in hindering, limiting, or dissuading individuals or groups from exercising their voting rights. So that's what voter suppression is. Anything that anyone does that results in or causes people not to exercise their right to vote. All right? That is voter suppression. So we know that many states have passed laws. We know that many states have put up all sorts of hindrances to make it more difficult for people to vote. It should be easy to vote, but these states, based on this lie about election fraud, have put up blocks and hindrances to people's right to exercise the franchise to vote, and especially regarding African Americans. One federal court found that these voter suppression laws with laser-like precision have targeted the African American community. So that's why you need to know what these laws are. All right, now, before we get into them, let me give you some brief history, because it is important that you understand where we've come from, so that you can understand where we are, so that you can understand where we're going. All right, so that's the purpose of understanding some history. So for the first 240 years of this country, only white men could vote. Only white men with property rights could vote. Despite the Declaration of Independence, which said all men are created equal and are endowed with certain inalienable rights from their creator, among them the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. Despite that, only white men with property could vote for the first 2.5 centuries of this country. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, but it had no enforcement teeth. We know the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment made African American citizens, gave us due process rights, gave us equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment stated essentially that no one could abridge our right to vote, but there was no enforcement mechanism. So after Reconstruction, that period right after the Civil War, another period started. I've talked to you about this before, called redemption. Redemption. So Reconstruction is when African Americans made some leadway. Blacks were elected to Congress. It looked like things were going to improve for African Americans, but it was short-lived because of something called the Compromise of 1877. And it was when the northern states negotiated a deal with southern states to allow the northern states to keep control of the presidency. Rutherford B. Hayes became the president in exchange for the South's ability to control the South, essentially. And at that moment, Reconstruction ended and redemption began. And you could also call redemption the beginning of Jim Crow. So Southern states began to implement a lot of black code laws, and including in those laws were voter suppression laws. So blacks could not vote except they paid poll taxes or they passed literacy tests or they were exempted because of the grandfather clauses. There was violence, all sorts of things that Southern whites did to prevent blacks from voting despite the 15th Amendment. And that lasted for a little bit short of 100 years to 1965 when President Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, the Voting Rights Law required those Southern states to get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before they made any changes to their voting laws, and that was effective at preventing them from implementing poll taxes, grandfather clauses, etc. And the Voting Rights Act was very, very instrumental in stopping all of the voter suppression that the Southern states were known for doing. So essentially, the Voting Rights Act is the most significant piece of civil rights legislation in American history. So from 1965 to 2013, the Voting Rights Act protected African Americans' right to vote. In fact, the Voting Rights Act was so effective at protecting African Americans' right to vote that in 2008, African Americans were able to elect Barack Obama and then re-elect him in 2012. So that was when white Americans said, that's enough. So then, in 2013, SCOTUS handed down a case called Shelby County versus Holder, where they essentially gutted very important provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And the very next day after SCOTUS gutted the Voting Rights Act, several states, North Carolina, Texas, and Florida wasn't far behind, implemented or enacted voter suppression laws to keep blacks from voting. And we're going to look at a couple of those in just a moment. And in 2021, more red states enacted another slew of voter suppression laws. That was after the January 6, 2021 insurrection attempt. And those voter suppression laws are based on Trump's fake stolen election claims. All right. Sadly, too, there are many blacks who are helping whites suppress black votes with antics like vote the couch. You see, that's a voter suppression method as well. Because remember our definition, anything by any means, regardless of the source, that results in people not voting is voter suppression. And quite frankly, I thought I would never see the day where black people are helping suppress other black people's votes. But that is precisely what is happening now. All right, now, against that brief history, let's look at some of the voter suppression laws that have been implemented since 2013, and again, another slew in 2021. All right, so first, new voter ID laws. So voter ID laws require voters to present specific types of identification at polling stations. These IDs are often limited to government-issued forms such as driver's license, state IDs, or passports. Now, many of us would say, what is the big deal with presenting a driver's license, state ID, or passport? Well, for most people, it's not a big deal. But for a lot of other people, it is a big issue for various reasons. For example, I helped a young man that I was representing in court get his state-issued ID, and it was a very arduous process. He lived about 30 miles away from the DMV, and he didn't have a car, so I ended up taking him in my car. And when he got there, he had to have certain IDs just to get the state ID that he was trying to get. So he had to have, I think, like a birth certificate. And this young man was about 19, 20 years old, so he didn't know where his birth certificate was. So when we went the first time, he couldn't get that state-issued ID. I had to take him home, and we waited a couple of weeks for him to find his birth certificate, and then we took him back. Well, look, that took a 2-week period. That took a lot of time. That took a lot of travel just for him to get a state-issued ID. So can you imagine so many people in low-income neighborhoods, in other places that it's just difficult to get to the DMV? It may be a certain part, for example, here in South Dallas, the buses may not even take you to the DMV, which is on the other side of Great Big Dallas, right? Some of the folks don't have money to pay the bus fare to get to the DMV. And so it's just shaving off those voters, just preventing those people from voting can result in tilting an election in one way or another. If voter ID laws, for example, can interfere in a given state with, say, 10,000 voters, that's enough for somebody to lose or win an election. And again, quite often, those types of laws, this voter ID law, they tend to target low-income, African-American, or Hispanic voters, even the elderly. For example, check out this ABC story here in Texas about an elderly black woman who had a very difficult time trying to get registered to vote.
Today is the deadline for people who want to vote in the state of Texas to register for statewide elections there next month. And voting rights advocates say that thousands of voters, mostly minority voters, are at risk of being disenfranchised after that state passed a strict new voter ID law. We caught up with one voter who says he's going to miss that deadline and says the law is to blame. Here's our Alex Perche on the story of one voter in Texas and what it tells us about voting rights there.
For 82-year-old Elmira Hicks, driving has gotten harder lately. She can still do it just fine, but she's had to battle getting her license renewed.
My ability to get a license is completely impossible.
Texas, like other states, requires a birth certificate for a real ID. Ms. Hicks was born at a time when those records weren't always kept.
I do feel like the laws right now are targeting my mother and other African Americans in this country.
She and her daughter battled in court, a judge even ruling in their favor. Still, technicalities have kept her from getting a license. She also says it will keep her from voting. Today, a critical deadline to register to vote in the state's next election in November. On the ballot, 8 amendments ranging from taxes to judicial eligibility. Amendments that Ms. Hicks won't be able to vote on.
I can't vote without a proper identification. My voice does not count. They've completely shut me down.
It's actually very common for individuals not to be able to get their birth certificates.
People have died just to vote. People have stood in line and in the rain. Women fought to vote. And now I can't vote.
In this country, race correlates to a lot of different characteristics. So, for example, if you take voter identification laws, which we've been talking about, people of color, so African Americans, Latinos, will be less likely to have the underlying documents that you need in order to get the ID in the first place, so in order to get a driver's license.
And Texas recently passed one of the most restrictive voting laws in the country. It bans drive-through voting, has new ID requirements for mail-in voting, and has new regulations for early voting hours. It's a law Professor Fernita Tolson specifically called racist during a congressional subcommittee hearing because she believes it disproportionately impacts black and brown voters.
What voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
We expanded the number of hours for people to vote. We expanded the number of days so people could vote.
State Representative Steve Toth supports the new law expanding voter ID requirements.
The recourse is, if they can't get a driver's license, to go to DPS with a social security card or some other ID and to get an ID so that you can vote. It's free.
Toth admits most people register to vote using their driver's license. And in the case of Ms. Hicks, going through the extra hoops of obtaining a voter identification card isn't so easy. She lives in a rural area, and without her license, she can't drive herself to the Department of Public Safety.
I mean, so it's very effective at shaving off just enough votes to tilt an election toward those who enacted these new voter ID laws. That's how this game works. It is just trying to get enough voters frustrated where they'll just say, forget it, I'm not going through all of that just to get an ID, I'm not voting. All right, so new voter ID laws. Now, what states? We know Georgia has, we know Texas has, we know Wisconsin has, we know Arizona has, we also know North Carolina has enacted these new voter ID laws. So go to your state's Secretary of State's website to find out if your state has enacted new voter ID laws. Second, mail-in voting restrictions. Mail-in voting restrictions. All right, so we know what mail-in voting is. You get your ballot through the mail, you complete it, you fill it out, and you send it back or you drop it off. Well, there are all kinds of restrictions now because remember, Trump and MAGA made such a big deal out of mail-in voting. They claimed that that was really where a whole lot of the fraud occurred, although they were not able to show or put forth any evidence showing widespread mail-in voter fraud. Anyway, mail-in voting restrictions impose strict regulations on how mail ballots are distributed, collected, and counted. These restrictions can affect voters who rely on mail-in voting, including the elderly, disabled, and those with transportation or scheduling challenges. These barriers may reduce voter participation and disenfranchise vulnerable populations. And that's the goal of these laws, just to shave off enough vulnerable voters. That's it. Not trying to stop everybody from voting. This is not like the poll taxes. This is not like the grandfather clauses or literacy tests. It just makes voting a little more difficult for vulnerable populations. And those voters who cannot meet these standards, if they can't vote, quite often, that's enough to turn an election. What states have implemented mail-in voting restrictions? Florida, Texas, Arizona, Wisconsin, Nevada, and there may be others. Check your local state. Limitations on ballot drop boxes. These laws limit the number, location, and accessibility of ballot drop boxes, which provide a secure way for voters to submit mail ballots or mail-in ballots. Restricting drop boxes may reduce convenience for voters, particularly in urban areas where access was previously more widespread. So this is just where you drop off your ballot. If you have a mail-in ballot, this is where you drop it off at. All right, so many of these states limited how many of these ballot drop boxes there are. Georgia, Florida, Texas, Arizona. Now again, keep in mind, other states, including your state, if it's not on this list, may have done this. And let me show you how bad this is. Here in Texas, the governor ordered that each county have only one drop-off box. Now think about a county as big as Dallas County where there are 10 million people. Think about someone in South Dallas needing to drop off their ballot, and there's one drop-off ballot in some other part of Dallas County. Dallas County is so big you could put, for example, 3 or 4 Atlantas. I believe. I know you could get one Atlanta just in southern Dallas County. So you could put 2 or 3 or 4 Atlantas, cities the size of Atlanta, in Dallas County. And if there's only one drop-off box for a county this size, or a county the size of Harris County, down where Houston is, that's going to shave off a lot of voters. That's going to cause a lot of voters to say, forget it, I'm not voting. That's voter suppression. That is voter suppression. We don't see the dogs, we don't see the water hoses, we don't see that with this style of voter suppression. But it's just as lethal when you got to go way across county to drop off your mail-in ballot, or when you don't have the requisite ID and you can't get to the DMV. All right? This is voter suppression. This is how Trump and MAGA intends to suppress votes come election time. Okay? Let's go back. Reduction of early voting days. This is another very effective way to suppress votes. So these laws reduce the days or hours available for early voting, limiting options for those who cannot vote on election day. And that's quite a few people because they can't get off work. They may be in school. So they can't, take that day off to go vote. I think that voting, the day we vote should be a national holiday where everybody is excused from working so that they can go vote, because I generally believe that people should be able to vote without hassle. Voting should be the easiest thing that we do here in this democracy that we live in. Voting should be, again, a relatively easy process. But the GOP is on the record saying that they want to make voting hard because they don't want everybody voting. Remember, the first 240 years of this country, only white men voted. And that is really the way a whole lot of white men want it now. And that's why they have implemented or enacted these voter suppression laws. So reduction of early voting days is another way to suppress black votes. And we know that at least 3 states have done this. There are more. There are more. Georgia, Iowa, North Carolina. There are 3 that I got listed here, but there are more. So check your state's SOS, Secretary of State's website regarding voting, and see if they've reduced early voting days in your state. All right. Purging voter rolls. Voter roll purges involve removing inactive voters from the registration list, often targeting those who have not voted in recent elections. Purges can mistakenly remove eligible voters, leading to disenfranchisement if they are unaware of their removal. Confusion and frustration may arise if voters are unexpectedly removed from the rolls. So there are at least 4 states that have enacted such laws: Ohio, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Texas. Now, Texas will allow even third parties to initiate voter purging. So there are some third party organizations that are sending in people's names to the voting officials, asking to remove those people's names from the voter rolls. That is literally happening. So you need to call your election office and make sure your name has not been removed from the voting roll, because third parties are doing this. Or if you haven't actively voted in a couple of cycles, your name may be already removed. So think about it. You pull up to vote, you expect your name to be on the voter roll, and it's not there because it's been purged. Don't let that happen to you. Okay? So just go ahead and make sure your name has not been removed. Changing poll locations. Changing poll locations. These laws involve changing or reducing polling locations, which can lead to fewer polling places in certain areas. Now, this is the very reason why we have seen such long lines, especially in African American communities. I mean, long lines, blocks, half a mile, people waiting in line. And in Georgia, if you remember, they got this ridiculous law where you can't give someone some water who's been standing in a voting line for a long time. Now, I read recently, I don't know if it's still in place, but a judge had overturned that, but I don't know what the current law is. So if you're in Georgia, you should absolutely go to the Georgia Secretary of State's website just to see if this has changed, because if you're expecting there to be a lot of poll locations like maybe the last voting cycle, you may be really surprised to know that there are not. Many of them have been eliminated. And remember, this is much more subtle than back in the 60s and 50s and 40s, but it's just as effective, especially with vulnerable populations. All right, what states? This is not all of them, but Arizona, Georgia, Texas have all reduced poll locations. All right, so if there were 10 The last voting cycle, it may be as few as 5 or even fewer this time. And quite often, they're in the white community, making it much more difficult for blacks to vote, which is the whole purpose of voter suppression laws. What else? New voter registration requirements. So getting someone registered to vote is more difficult. These laws introduce more stringent requirements for voting registration, such as proof of citizenship or restricted registration methods. Increased complexity can deter new voters, especially young people and minorities, from registering. Minorities and low-income individuals may face increased challenges in meeting new registration requirements. Now, imagine trying to show proof of citizenship, for example, I guess your birth certificate, if you haven't had that thing in many, many, many years, or maybe you lost it. You may say, well, yeah, but everybody should know where their birth certificate is. Well, not everyone does. And those people who don't are going to find it more difficult to register to vote. Okay? States that have implemented new voter registration requirements include Kansas, Texas. Notice Texas has been on every one of these lists. So these are not the only states, but check the Secretary of State's website for your state to see if there are more stringent registration requirements if you need to register to vote. All right? Restrictions on third-party registration. I can remember back in the day, our church or our nonprofit would get folks registered to vote. We would be therefore considered a third party trying to register people. Well, under this current set of laws, we would have serious restrictions trying to get somebody registered to vote. This says these laws impose fines, regulations, or other barriers on organizations conducting voter registration drives. Restrictions can hinder registering new voters, particularly in minority communities. Civic organizations play a vital role in increasing voter registration, and limitations can reduce new voter participation. Just keep in mind, these are subtle ways to suppress votes, just to prevent the right number of people from being able to register and vote. States that have these restrictions on third-party registration include Florida, Texas, Tennessee, and I'm sure there are other states. So make sure you look up your state. Criminal charges for election officials. Now, this is to intimidate election officials. I think about, for example, the 2 African-American women that Trump tried to intimidate, other MAGA members tried to intimidate down in Georgia who were counting votes. I mean, they tried to intimidate those 2 women, I think was mother-daughter, and they didn't. Those women stood their ground, and they did their jobs, and they did it with honor and integrity. They ended up suing Rudy Giuliani and won a bunch of money from him. I hope they get paid that money. But this type of law is to intimidate election officials. All right, this says these laws impose criminal penalties on election officials for various infractions such as mishandling ballots or failing to follow procedures. I mean, you just inadvertently don't follow procedure, and here you are getting prosecuted. These laws can intimidate election workers, leading to potential errors or reluctance to facilitate voting. Pressure on officials can impact the administration and fairness of elections. This is pure voter suppression. Pure. States that have these kind of laws are Georgia, Texas, Arizona. I told you Texas is just about on every list. Legislative control over election boards. Now, this is really, really, really bad. So state legislatures are now able to control local election boards. They should be independent, but states can now say to these election boards that you're not going to count those votes, or you are going to count those votes, what have you. They have literally set up what they need to steal this election. Because let's think about Georgia. Let's think about a voting district that has a lot of blacks there. All right. And Fulton County, for example. Yet the Georgia legislature is filled with MAGA members. So those MAGA members can say to Fulton County, you can't count those votes. You must count those votes. You got to throw those votes out. I mean, that could be enough to just completely, totally steal an election. You remember Trump called and said he just needed 11,000 votes? Well, the legislature of a lot of these states could simply get rid of 11,000 votes easily. They have stuff in place to steal this election. Georgia, Arizona, Arkansas are just a couple of states that I have on this list. So those are the 10 voter restriction, voter suppression, I would say racist laws that red states have enacted to suppress votes and to steal this election. You need to know what these are. You may need to watch this video over again and again. Or certainly you can go and research these matters yourself. In fact, you should, just to see and make sure that you will not be impacted by these laws. Because we need a great, great, great turnout on November 5th, 2024. And as the judge said,
For the past 3.5 years, the former president has corrupted American democracy, such that, in my view, there is only one candidate for the presidency and one political party in America that today can claim the mantle of protector and defender of America's democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law.
there's only one political party right now that is the caretaker of our democracy, because Trump has corrupted the other one. That's what the judge said, who is a Republican, and he's a conservative. And those are his words. All right? So don't let them jam you up. Don't get to your polling station to find out your name has been removed or some other trickery went on and you can't vote and you got one day to do it and you can't cast your vote. You stood in line and so forth. No, make sure that doesn't happen to you. All right. That's what I wanted to share with you in this video. I am Attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. Thank you for watching from the beginning to the end. Share this video, share it, share it, share it, share it with many others. Again, so they won't be victims of these voter suppression, voter restriction laws either. Until the next time, peace.